So let's start with the brief self-introduction. So Mario, would you able to start?
So I'm Mari Grace. I'm a litigation partner at Davis Polk here in Washington, D.C. I do a broad range of litigation, both on the civil side and the white-collar side, but a big piece of my practice involves giving legal advice on litigation risk and also regulatory risk for non-U.S. companies that are either operating businesses in the U.S. or have securities that are sold in the U.S.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Daisuke for coordinating this conference and having me here today. It's such an honor and pleasure. So my name is Naoko Matsuzaki. I'm a managing director at KPMG Forensics and Risk Advisory. I currently focus my practice on advising clients to mitigate corporate misconduct / white-collar crime. Originally, I come from industry with a legal background as in-house counsel, but I switched to professional services a few years ago. So I'm kind of seeing things from the inside and the outside, so to speak. And at KPMG, because we are an audit firm, our job is to promote this healthy development of the capital market, and we will not tolerate misrepresentation of financial and non-financial information. And I think we will touch upon it later on as we talk about ESG-related disclosures.
Thank you. Tomoyo-san, would you able to have a sort of introduction as well?
Actually, if you are not using a mic, I cannot hear you very well. Perhaps you wanted me to introduce myself?
Yes, please.
My name is Tomoyo Matsui. I'm teaching commercial and company law at University of Tokyo. And mainly I'm dealing the corporate governance systems and supply chain. So the theme of this symposium is very fitting to my interest. And I'm also chairing the latest sheets of corporate supply chain human rights guidelines, and I'm attending the committee at the Financial Agency's sustainability disclosure. So my comment will be a kind of report from the Japanese today's important issues. So let's see you.
Thank you, Tomoyo-san. So to start off, we would like to discuss the big picture of the global developments and regulatory trends, and perhaps we can start from the recent trends in the United States, that there are significant changes under the current administration. So, Marty, would you able to?
Sure. And is everybody okay without a mic? So we're talking about supply chain management. I'll just quickly touch on the Labor Force Labor Prevention Act, the UFLPA. So it was put in place under the Biden administration, but the U.S. has for some time been focused on imports that are impacted by forced labor, particularly coming from China. But two things, I think, primarily. First is there has been an increase in enforcement under the UFLPA. So if you look at the statistics that Customs and Border Protection put out on detentions of shipments into the U.S. for goods that are suspected to be the product of forced labor from Xinjiang, there's a significant increase. So I think as of this summer, there was something like 16,000 plus imports, shipments have been detained. And it's also roughly half that have been released, with the other half that have been subject to either detention or have not been allowed to come into the U.S. So that is an increase. And the second thing is, under the UFLPA, there is now a rebuttable presumption that any import coming from that region is the product of forced labor. And so everyone's trying to figure out basically what that means and what you have to do to get over that presumption. And I'm curious to hear if anyone in the room has heard differently, but as of now, I don't think there is any clear guidance. I think it's something like 5 or so companies have tried to seek an exception from CBP to get guidance to figure out what they actually have to show. What is the clear and convincing evidence that you can provide, and there hasn't been any decision on that yet. So I think companies are struggling to figure out, what you would actually do to get your goods released, once you've been targeted. So those are big picture, the two things going on in the U.S.
Thank you. So I don't think the current administration in the States is motivated by the human rights initiative.
Oh, no, definitely not. Yeah, they are focused on national security. I can't remember, is this being recorded? Okay, so consistent with what the administration has publicized, it is national security and the U.S.'s economic self-interest, which I think for a long time has been the case when we focus on labor issues, but I think that has been, focused on again by this administration.
But do you still expect the UFLPA enforcement going forward?
Oh, yes, definitely. And I think it will increase.
Yeah. Thank you. So as Mari just mentioned, the United States is focusing on the trade regulation and the forced labor among the human rights. And on the other hand, in the EU, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which is called CSRD, which requires large companies to conduct the human rights and environmental due diligence, was adopted last year after a long year discussion. But the interesting discussions are still ongoing to simplify the requirements. And also the new regulation banning products made with forced labor is expected to take effect by the end of 2027. So I'm not sure Tomo-san is here, but my next question for Tomoyo-san would be how the development in the United States and the EU may shape Japan's future regulatory approach.
Okay, well, recently, domestic enforcement framework for preventing human rights abuse is very weak in Japan. Japan's Ministry of Economic Trade and Industry introduced due diligence guideline only on 2022, and this guideline is only a breakdown of United States guiding principles, so and currently based, which means not enforceable per se. And METI is now trying to introduce authentication system under which compliant corporations can be recognized as such in EU or other regulated markets. But on the contrary, it is important to understand that many of the acts that are considered white-collar crimes by the DOJ or US is also a source of civil liability under Japanese law. Under Japanese company law, directors are under duty of care, which includes compliance and oversight duty. With that duty, directors are obliged to comply with foreign regulations as well as domestic Japanese laws. This compliance and oversight duty was first declared in an epoch-making case law on shareholder derivative suit concerning violation of U.S. regulation in Japan. In 1995, the trading management at Daiwa Bank's New York branch concealed huge trading losses, leading to the arrest of New York branch manager and an order from regulatory authorities to withdraw the bank's subsidiary branch from the United States. As the derivative suit, Osaka District Court recognized that directors breached their duty of care by not introducing reasonable internal control system or by overseeing branches' illegal act by gross negligence. Regarding the plea bargaining in the United States, in which the company pleaded guilty and paid an enormous fine, the Osaka District Court ruled that failure to report in the United States in violation of the law should not be allowed even as business judgment in Japan, and ordered the 11 directors at the time to jointly pay a total of $245 million. So this is a very enormous sum at that time, based on their respective levels of responsibility. This case illustrated the fact that compliance duty covered not only the duties stated in Japanese company law or securities regulation, but also other regulations that serve various social orders, including overseas regulations. So it is also understood that directors are not liable if he could not determine whether a specific company act violated the law because of the absence of clear enforcement standard. And if under such circumstances he reasonably decides that he could go forward with the risk of his company being fined or prosecuted in the future. So for non-compliance of UFLPA or CSDDD, directors are under risk of shareholders' derivative suit. And there's not high, but some possibility that directors are held liable for not appropriately controlled others in his company. Even if so, I think that currently there are chances that directors successfully utilize uncertain enforcement standard defenses. Even with voluntary guidelines in Japan, companies will obtain more supply chain information in the future, so I think that might contribute either to lower the enforcement uncertainty or to heighten the required level for the duty of care for directors. Thank you.
Thank you, Tomo-san. So in the context of human rights and sustainability and action-led implementation and disclosure are inseparable. So Naoki-san, how about the global regulatory trends of ESG or sustainability disclosure?
So from a disclosure perspective, the EU has been leading the legislation, such as the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the CSRD, and the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, the ESRS. And they really require this very detailed disclosure of E, S, and G information. So Japanese companies who do have business or touch point to the EU market has been making efforts trying to prepare and abide by this EU regulations. Well, obviously there is this pushback, so we'll see how it's going to play out. And turning to Japan, we do have the Sustainability Standards Board of Japan, the so-called SSBJ, who is developing the sustainability disclosure standards, which is based on the IFRS sustainability disclosure standards. So it's coming up very soon. And just to kind of approach it from a risk management perspective, because I'm with the Forensics and Risk Advisory, that my view is that Japanese companies have this long-established system of gathering financial information, whereas when it comes to non-financial information, it becomes a little bit challenging because the coverage is so broad, and you have to collect all the information from multiple organizations, and there has not been an established system to collect such information and verify its accuracy. So I think that's the non-financial part has been a little bit of a challenge. And my view is that probably many of you know that Japanese companies tend to have like a silo organization and silo data. So because it's so decentralized that the companies are having difficulty collecting all the information and gathering it, and plus avoid any inconsistency or misrepresentation, misstatement of the information.
Thank you. And I feel that many of the Japanese companies have traditionally very conservative view about the disclosure of non-financial information. Mm-hmm. And Tomoe-san, so in light of the global trends of disclosure that the Naoki-san just mentioned, what do you think about the future direction that the Japanese authorities are going to take?
This authority's attitude on sustainable disclosure, I mentioned that it clearly wants to encourage rather than punish companies that are willing to comply this new disclosure scheme. As Naoko-san mentioned, there are some waypoints in Japanese companies' characteristics. So the Japanese basic attitude is that if companies spite of the not so welcoming political environment. So, but if they, as long as they are doing their best, they are not punished. Well, in 2024, Japan decided to make sustainability disclosure mandatory for private listed companies with a market capitalization of over 3 trillion yen from the 2027 fiscal year. And then it plans to expand the application standard to smaller companies. And so this approach has not changed despite the changes in the situation such as the omnibus bill or the Trump administration in the United States. And this policy singles out the private listed companies that have close ties to large international institutional investors under the Financial Instruments and Exchange Act rather than the Companies Act. So this means that they not taking action is a risk for that type of companies only. So with this type of companies, the Japanese government is not changing attitudes towards sustainability. However, since sustainability disclosure, since Japan has only recently introduced both the non-financial disclosure system and the sustainability disclosure system, there are many situations where the adjustment is needed. So one such example is misstatement liability. Japan at the start simply expanded the framework of financial information statement liability to non-financial information. Problematically, Japan has previously introduced the assumption of negligence for the financial misstatement. Company must rebut the negligence claims by showing that they did their fair part to disclose accurate information. And so accordingly, companies could be extremely vulnerable once if investors succeed to claim that there is material misstatement in their non-financial information. If this risk expands to sustainability engagement information, risk of securities litigation will further be escalated. But if administration wanted to encourage rather than punish disclosure, this imposing strict liability is not the answer. So, seeing the expansion of event-driven securities litigation to the United States, now Financial Services Agencies Council is working hard to set up a safe harbor in the field of sustainability disclosure and also to limit the area of strict negligence standard only to financial information disclosure. So that's my view. Thank you.
Thank you, Tomo-san. So we just briefly covered an overview of the enforcement and disclosure. And this is a bit outside the supply chain discussion, but we cannot ignore the impact of anti-DII policies under a recent administration. So Mari, would you be able to share a bit about that?
I like that you just call it recent. Yeah, so the impact on disclosures. Yeah, so as everybody knows, we moved in one direction post George Floyd in the U.S. in terms of DEI-related disclosure, and now we've swung in a very different direction. And I feel my personal view is it was a little unfair because we took the lead in one direction, sort of pulled the rest of the world with us to come along, and then we did an about face, and the rest of the world's like, oh, we really care about this, and we've been moving in this direction. So in terms of disclosure, I think in the U.S., or companies operating in the U.S., there has been an effort, I think, across the board to update the way that companies talk about what used to be referred to as DEI. Things like removing language that says diversity or that says equality or talks about particular protected classes under the statutes that we have here to protect civil rights, and a movement to using what I would view as more generic terms like inclusion and engagement and belonging. So that's on the disclosure side, and I think companies that operate in the U.S. but also have similar obligations in other parts of the world, it's been a challenge to kind of thread the needle to make sure that you're telling, your shareholders and telling the public and also telling your own employees and your other stakeholders what you're doing, so that they understand what the company's practices are while also meeting, whatever expectations exist in the US and other places where, disclosures are subject to scrutiny. So I think companies have now landed at a place where they feel like they're able to thread the needle, but we had a few months earlier this year where I think it was pretty challenging.
Oh, thank you. So I heard that many of the Japanese companies are struggling to understand the scope of the anti-BI equity, which is whether that is more of a disclosure issue itself or whether they have to change the content of the program itself.
Yeah, I think if companies have operations in the US, then it does require, sort of doing an audit of what your actual practices are. And obviously, if you have 0 operations in the US, the risk is just lower in terms of, there actually being some consequence. But I think for companies that are US based or have operations here, I think people have been going through and doing, whether it's, a more robust audit or some kind of review to make sure that they feel comfortable that the actual practices and programs and the like they feel, would be okay under the current administration's view on what constitutes illegal.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes sense. And just as an example of the anti-DII that is kind of unique to the states, and there are like various regulations in there across the board, and I think there are sometimes different or even conflicting regulations in different jurisdictions. So now, Sam, what do you think about how the global companies should respond to such a conflicting regulations?
Yeah, I totally understand it's challenging, but at the same time, my view from more like the corporate policy perspective, they should have like a North Star, meaning that you should have like a corporate value proposition that creates a sustainable company. So companies should not be swinging one way or the other just because the administration changed or because you operate in a different jurisdiction. So I had a company talk to me saying that, can we have like 2 different green claims, in one in Japan and one in the EU for the same product, simply because, as you know, the EU has more strict laws and regulations versus in Japan it's more relaxed. And I was like, I'm not sure if that's a good idea, because you shouldn't be inconsistent in what you're saying out in the world, regardless of the language or the jurisdiction.
Thank you. I completely agree with that, and I think it applies to the human rights students as well, because there are a lot of individual laws regulating that, and safe to release text is also changing, but it's still, as of the North Star, that should be UN guiding principles for the human rights students. So it will be most important for that.
Can I ask you a question on that, about the North Star, because I like that concept a lot. Do you think the North Star needs to be driven by a business imperative, or do you think it's okay to have a North Star that's just a moral imperative? Because I think that's something we struggle with here in talking about DEI, is, if you can come up with a business purpose for that, is that enough to kind of say, okay, this doesn't apply because it's a business need? And I think companies have struggled with that, and for the most part, I think have not been able to come up with something that's like clearly articulated to say we have to do this and we feel like we can justify it and not get scrutinized. So I'm curious if you think a moral imperative is enough for the North Star.
Well, it's my personal opinion that is that it should be aligned.
Yeah.
So if it's like a moral, that it should also grow the business. Right?
Yeah.
You shouldn't be violating human rights and make money out of it. So that's how I think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's fine as long as the business-driven concept is rationalized by the UN guiding principle and international norms. So maybe for the next topic, I'd like to shift our focus to more supply chain management and discuss how companies should respond and consider the regulation that we just talked about. So again, now, what are the biggest challenges for global companies to enhance supply chains transparency?
Talking more from a Japanese company's perspective, which I'm more familiar with, there are so many companies still collecting data or information manually based on self-reporting, such as distributing supplier questionnaires and collecting them. So if you don't have any like safeguards to its accuracy or reliability, then someone can just conceal or falsify the information. So in order to avoid that, number one, I think technology should help, meaning that if technology can connect like the entire supply chain and make all the relationships and the information transparent, then it should be more easier to manage the entire supply chain information. And number two, I would say the risk-based approach, meaning that, well, obviously everyone knows what the risk-based approach is, but Japanese companies tend to be very comprehensive. So if you had, I don't know, like 500 or 1,000 suppliers, they want to cover all of them, right? But it's not feasible from a resource perspective. So rather, you should focus your resources on the most high-risk transactions or suppliers, and you should actually do like factory visits or like global employee interviews instead of making so much effort distributing all these questionnaires to thousands of your suppliers.
Thank you. Marty, you are saying many of the U.S. companies, so what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think here too, especially, following the enactment of the UFLPA, to try to enhance what they're doing. So kind of the baseline continues to be these certifications that you get from suppliers that say, they're abiding by forced labor laws. They've confirmed that their downstream suppliers are also complying with forced labor laws. They're not aware of any violations of forced labor laws. And I think the second step is what you mentioned, kind of identifying the most important suppliers and then spending time understanding and doing due diligence on factories, understanding what sorts of corporate compliance programs they have. And then I think the newest step that at least large companies are starting to do is to actually hire third-party vendors that have data sets on places that source, various products from, particular regions of the world. And they actually hire vendors who use the same data set that CBP uses. So that when they are, doing their tracking, their supply chain tracking, the data they see is what they know CBP will see. So that if or when they actually get a request for information, because again, like I said, there's like no real guidance about what you're supposed to do. The two things they tell you to do are respond to all CBP requests for information, and then provide clear and convincing evidence that you're not using forced labor. So like no one knows what to do with the second one, but on the first one, at the very least, if you're using the same like data set that CBP is using, you'll be able to say, okay, when CBP looks at this shipment, this is the supply chain they're going to see. These are where the red flags are going to be, and these are the things we're going to focus on to explain to them why actually, the products that we are taking from this ship are actually not the result of forced labor from this region. And so that's the new thing that I've seen companies start to do is hire, and it's really actually a small group of companies that do this. Carum, for anyone who wants to know, is the one that uses like the same data set that CBP does. And they work with various vendors. And so that's the one thing that I think is new, so that basically large companies can be ready when they get that information request to be able to confront it.
So just a quick question. So many companies have to take care of the national security, as you just mentioned, and is the same data set should be used for that separate purpose?
It's a good question. Actually, no, which is very annoying. So like you have different vendors that have different data sets that they use. So like the one I mentioned is focused on basically UFLPA compliance. So like they have these vast networks in China that, do all this tracking. And then you have different companies that, are sort of the preeminent ones on sanctions, on national security and the like. And so again, it's a small group of companies that do this, but I think depending on what you're focused on, which guys use.
So that should be a big burden, additional burden for us.
It is an additional burden. That's why I said it's all large companies who are doing this. Not large companies, I think, are struggling because they, might have like one third-party compliance contractor who works a few hours a week who's like on Google trying to figure this out. And that's, I've done that work. Some of my friends are in the back here who have also done this work. And it can be really challenging. Yeah.
Thank you. So I think we have a few minutes break, so I'd like to turn to a more specific human rights risk. And could you share one of the key takeaways from recent cases or a discussion that you think are particularly important? We now exactly start.
So I earlier touched upon more of like the mandatory disclosure part, which is being legislated, but my other trend that I'm seeing is that companies should also watch out for non-mandatory, voluntary disclosure, which could be a sustainability report or just like a TV commercial or, a poster on the street, because stakeholders are paying attention to your non-financial and voluntary information, whether it's like a green claim or like a social claim, regardless. And they do make investment decisions or purchase choices or where to employer choices. So the so-called washing or the fraudulent disclosures can lead to potential claims and litigation on top of regulatory enforcement.
Thank you. So maybe Thomas, would you like to add to the Naoki-san's point? Oh, sorry.
My view, well, Japanese situation is greatly differs. Like in Japan's society, usually activists only goes to court when they want to suspend some specific activities, and usually the consumers and the large society just moves for the accidental some events that are not very big movement in Japanese society overall. So, well, I'm not overall concerned about that reputational risks, and they are not overreacting to the voluntary disclosure. And perhaps I'm a legal person, and the usual understanding is that the disclosure, legal disclosure, accompanies the legal responsibility, whereas the social voluntary disclosure only accompanies the reputational risk. And your assumption is that reputational risk is great in Japanese society, but well, it is not a very stable thing. So I'm not so over concerned instead.
Thank you, Thomas. And then I feel like sorry. Thomas, I'm sorry. I was muted.
Is it? Is it okay?
Yeah, yes.
Okay.
So, sorry, please go ahead.
Oh, perhaps I should not be using up your time.
Sorry, Thomas. I just wanted to say that I also think the washing risk is very important, but at the same time, as a lawyer, to the reminder of myself, if you emphasize the washing risk too much, it may discourage companies to take an effort on the implementation and the disclosure of human rights initiatives. So we may have to keep the balance of it. Yeah. And Marie, would you like to add a final thought?
I guess maybe just one quick thing, picking up on what we said before about EU ESG requirements, just for those who do anything in California. We didn't talk at all about US ESG disclosures because, we're moving in a certain direction there too. But there's a lot of state law regulations in the US that are totally different from the federal regulations. So I was actually on a call earlier today where we were like, we're doing all of this for the EU and California. And you gotta remember it's both. And so, and also New York and California are two states that like to put out a lot of their own regulations, and companies often have operations in both places, and those two places are not being consistent with federal law. So just something to keep in mind.
Thank you. So we want to throw that in, but any question from audience? Okay. Oh, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation of commercial sales. I have two questions about supply chain regulation, supply chain management, particularly in the United States. And based on your presentation, I understood that the Illegal Forced Labor Prevention Act has been very actively enforced by the CBP right now. Can you tell me, if there is any targeted industry or targeted products, it used to be like cotton or tomato or silicone, but can you tell what is coming to that after that?
Yeah, so it's funny because every year the CBP puts out like a strategy document where they say what the new industries are. And if you look at them over the last few years, it feels like actually every industry is now on there. So it used to be textiles, like you said, but then it moved into anything that relates to, basically manufacturing of technology and defense. So they've added things like lithium and different kinds of metals and aluminum. So it's actually like quite broad as far as industry. So those are some of the ones that were on the recent list, is sort of different metals and things that go into building things like, phones, airplanes, cars. But I would go to the CDP website and look at sort of the strategy and priority document that they put out every year, because if you look at them, pretty much every company is going to have some product that appears on one of those lists. It's very broad.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. And if I may, thank you very much. And my second question is, other than the Illegal Forced Labor Prevention Act, do you see any trends, or about the reasons based on which the CDP has been actively, enforcing the suspension or try to stop the importation of alcohol or shipment into the United States, like country of origin or those kind of things?
Yeah, so it's very focused, and maybe just to take a step back, it's not like the U.S. forced labor laws have always just been focused on shipment. That's not the case, right? It's supposed to be global. It just happens to be that in practice it's very focused on that region. So we have statutes that predate the UFLPA that cover that. In terms of the last destination before it comes to the U.S., it's actually not China that makes up the majority. It's like Vietnam, Malaysia, other parts of Southeast Asia. But again, it's all shipments tied to the Xinjiang region. In terms of what they focus on, it's funny because I was trying to figure out whether there's anything you could glean, and pretty much everyone is talking about it as like the flipping of a coin. Which is terrible and is not giving anyone comfort, but that's the way people are talking about it, because given the number of shipments that are being detained and the really high number that are not released, people can't make sense of any rhyme or reason. So yeah, it really is, again, across the board. It seems like folks are still trying to figure out what the priority and what the target is.
Thank you very much.
So that brings us to the end of our session. So thank you very much.